Marcus Bell had always thought of himself as a simple man. At 36, he wasn't chasing riches or fame. All he wanted was stability, something solid to hold on to after years of grinding away as a long-haul truck driver. He had a modest brick house on the edge of Friloda, a small town where everyone seemed to know each other's business. He had a wife, Denise, who at least in the eyes of the town was loyal and supportive. And he had his father, Harold, a respected church deacon who carried himself like the moral backbone of the community. To Marcus, it looked like a foundation worth building on. Neighbors would see Marcus mowing the lawn on Saturday afternoons, Denise bringing out sweet tea in a tall glass, and Harold sitting on the porch, giving advice that sounded like scripture. To outsiders, it looked like the picture of Southern decency. But inside Marcus's chest, something never felt steady. He'd catch Denise staring out the window too long, her face blank, as if she were thinking of a life somewhere else. Nights on the road only made it worse. Marcus would call from distant highways, the roar of 18-wheelers in the background, and Denise's voice would always sound a little distracted, like she was only half listening. "Everything good at home, babe?" he'd ask one night, steering his rig through the black Texas plains. "Yeah, Marcus, everything's fine. You just worry about driving safe," she said softly. But she didn't say she missed him. She didn't say she loved him. That silence stuck with him like a splinter. Even Harold, his father, seemed too present in Marcus's marriage. Always around, always ready to fix a leaky faucet, mow a strip of grass Marcus had missed, or offer Denise rides in a town when Marcus was away. At first, Marcus told himself it was just family looking out for family. But sometimes he'd come home and notice how Denise lit up when Harold walked through the door, a smile brighter than the one she ever saved for him. Still, Marcus swallowed it. He told himself he was imagining things. After all, Harold was the man who raised him, taught him how to fish, how to pray, how to stand tall even when life tried to break you. Betrayal wasn't even in the vocabulary Marcus used for his father. Sunday dinners gave the illusion that all was well. Denise would cook cornbread and collard greens. Harold would lead the blessing with his deep, commanding voice, and Marcus would sit there convincing himself this was the kind of family other men dreamed about. But deep down, he noticed how Harold's hand would sometimes rest too long on Denise's shoulder when passing the mashed potatoes. He noticed how Denise laughed too hard at Harold's corny jokes, her eyes sparkling in a way they never did for him. One night, unable to hold it in, Marcus tried to address the growing distance. Denise was folding laundry in the bedroom, her back turned to him. "Feels like you're somewhere else even when you're right here," Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Denise paused, her hands clutching a shirt, but she didn't look at him. "You're just tired from the road, Marcus. You always think too much when you're tired. That ain't it. I know when something's wrong. I can feel it." Finally, she turned, her eyes cold and guarded. "Then maybe stop feeling so much." The words cut deeper than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Marcus stood there, stunned into silence, staring at the woman he thought he knew. What Marcus couldn't see yet, what he refused to imagine, was that his unease wasn't just paranoia. It was the early tremor of an earthquake that would soon split his life wide open. For now, though, he told himself to be patient, to trust his wife, to trust his father. But trust built on lies is nothing more than a house of cards, waiting for the wrong gust of wind to bring it all crashing down. And that gust was already on its way. Marcus tried to convince himself that the unease gnawing at his chest was just fatigue, a side effect of too many nights behind the wheel and too many miles of asphalt blurring together. But no matter how much he tried to silence it, the feeling only grew heavier. Something in his home, something in his marriage, wasn't right. It was in the way Denise avoided his touch when he came back from the road, leaning away when he reached for her, offering excuses about headaches or stress. It was in the way her laughter had become scarce with him, but easy, almost too easy, whenever Harold was around. And Harold was always around. Harold had a knack for showing up when Marcus least expected it. One Tuesday afternoon, Marcus pulled into the driveway after cutting his route short, only to see his father's truck parked outside. Inside, Harold was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee with Denise. They both froze when Marcus walked in. Denise looked startled, while Harold simply offered his son a smile, too casual to be real. "Didn't expect you home so early, boy," Harold said, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Yeah, well," Marcus muttered, setting his keys down. "Didn't expect you here either." It was meant as a joke, but the silence that followed made it sound more like an accusation. Denise jumped in too quickly. "Your dad was just helping me fix the back door hinge." It was squeaking again. Marcus nodded, but deep inside, suspicion flickered. Weeks passed, and the whispers around town grew louder. In small communities like Friloda, secrets never stayed secret for long. A friend from church, a man Marcus trusted, pulled him aside one evening after service. "Marcus," the friend said, lowering his voice, "I don't want to be the one to stir up trouble, but folks been talking. They see your daddy and Denise together a lot when you're gone. Too much, if you ask me." Marcus stiffened, his jaw tightening. "That's my wife. That's my father. People need to stop running their mouths." The friend looked at him with pity. "Sometimes the truth sounds like gossip before it breaks you." Marcus drove home that night with his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He replayed every laugh Denise gave Harold, every touch, every sideways glance. No, he told himself. Not his father. Not his wife. Some things were too sacred to betray. But the unease only deepened. One late evening, after finishing a delivery, Marcus swung by the church parking lot to drop off some papers Harold had left behind. That's when he saw them, Harold and Denise standing close together under the dim glow of a streetlight. Their voices were low, urgent, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that looked far too intimate. Marcus froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't hear their words, but the sight was enough. Denise touched Harold's arm, lingering there, and Harold leaned in as though whispering something only she was meant to hear. Marcus gripped the steering wheel until his palms ached. Every fiber in his body screamed to storm over and demand answers. But he stayed hidden in the shadows, paralyzed by disbelief. When they finally parted, slipping into separate cars, Marcus sat there long after they were gone, staring at the empty lot as if it had just swallowed his sanity whole. At home, Denise acted normal, moving through the house with quiet efficiency, never once betraying what Marcus had seen. He watched her fold laundry, brush her hair, and climb into bed, her back turned to him like always. He wanted to ask. He wanted to scream. But the words lodged in his throat, strangled by fear of what she might say. So he stayed silent, suffocating under the weight of doubt. What Marcus didn't know was that silence is the soil where betrayal thrives. Every unspoken question, every ignored suspicion, only gave Denise and Harold more room to grow bolder. And every day, Marcus's world was inching closer to the edge of collapse, closer to a moment that would turn whispered rumors into a nightmare of blood and gunfire. The morning of July 18th started like any other. The sun beat down on the blacktop, making the heat shimmer across the highways as Marcus hauled his last delivery. He was supposed to be gone until evening, but for once, everything moved faster than expected. By noon, his trailer was empty, the paperwork signed. He could have headed home, collapsed into bed, and called it a day. Instead, he thought about Denise. Maybe he'd been too harsh on her in his mind lately. Maybe the road had made him paranoid. He hadn't surprised her in months, hadn't shown up with something small to say, "I still care. I still notice you." That thought carried him as he swung his rig toward Friloda, the hum of the engine beneath him, the landscape rolling by in waves of heat. There was a KFC off the highway, the one Denise always craved after church. He smiled faintly, remembering her saying, "Baby, nothing fixes a bad day like fried chicken and biscuits." It wasn't much, but Marcus figured he'd pick up her favorite meal, extra crispy chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits dripping with honey, and walk through the door with it. Maybe she'd smile at him the way she used to. Maybe it would spark something they'd both lost. He turned into the parking lot, the air thick with the smell of grease and spice. That's when his heart stuttered. Parked near the entrance was Denise's car. At first, Marcus felt a flicker of warmth. Maybe she had the same idea. Maybe she'd wanted to surprise him too. But then suspicion slithered back in. Why hadn't she told him? Why here, in the middle of the day, when she thought he was still miles away on the road? Marcus stepped out of his truck, the scorching pavement radiating through his boots. The chatter of families floated from inside the restaurant, mixed with the shrieks of kids clamoring for fries. Everything looked ordinary, but Marcus's gut twisted tighter with each step toward the door. Inside, the KFC buzzed with lunchtime chaos. Teenagers behind the counter shouted orders, trays clattered, soda fountains hissed. Marcus scanned the booths, expecting to see Denise with a friend, maybe laughing over a bucket of chicken. But she wasn't there. Then he heard it. A muffled sound, faint but distinct, filtering from the direction of the restrooms. A laugh. A whisper. Something too intimate for a public place. His pulse quickened. He moved toward the hallway at the back, his boots heavy on the tile. The closer he got, the clearer the sounds became. Low voices, hurried breaths, the unmistakable rhythm of something no husband should ever hear outside a bathroom door. Marcus froze, staring at the women's restroom, then the men's. The men's door was closed. Locked. He pressed his ear to the wood, his chest heaving. And then he heard it, Denise's voice. Soft, trembling, but not with fear. With pleasure. And then, worse than any nightmare, he heard his father's voice. The hallway spun. The world collapsed into static. Marcus's throat burned as rage, heartbreak, and humiliation collided all at once. He pounded on the door, his fists slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. "Open this damn door," he roared. There was a gasp inside. A clatter. Denise's voice broke into panic. "Marcus." Another voice. Harold's. Deep, commanding but laced with fear. "Son, wait." Marcus slammed his shoulder against the door. Once. Twice. The lock snapped, and the door flew open. The sight that greeted him would never leave his memory. Denise and Harold tangled together in the cramped stall, their faces pale with shock, their clothes disheveled. His wife. His father. The two people who were supposed to love him most, betraying him in the filth of a fast food bathroom. Marcus staggered back, while rising in his throat. "No, no, no, no." His voice cracked, torn between disbelief and fury. Denise reached for him, tears streaking her face. "Marcus, please." But in that moment, Mercy was already dead. For a moment, Marcus couldn't breathe. The air in that cramped hallway felt poisoned, heavy with the stench of grease and betrayal. His vision blurred as his eyes locked on the two people who had just ripped the floor out from beneath him. Denise scrambled, tugging at her blouse, her face a mask of horror. "Marcus, please, it's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like." His voice thundered, breaking into a hoarse growl. He pointed at them with a trembling hand. "I just caught my wife and my father in a damn bathroom stall. How else is it supposed to look?" Harold's voice cracked with urgency, his hands raised as if surrendering. "Son, listen to me. This wasn't planned. It just happened. Just happened." Marcus laughed, but it came out like a snarl. "What? You tripped and fell into her arms." "My wife, Daddy. My wife." The sound of frightened whispers rose from the dining area as customers sensed something was terribly wrong. The hallway echoed with the sharp hum of fluorescent lights, buzzing like a hornet in Marcus's skull. Denise's tears spilled freely now, streaking down her cheeks. "Marcus, I swear I never meant for this. I was lonely. You were gone all the time. I was weak. Lonely." Marcus stepped closer, his chest heaving. "So you filled that hole with my father? You had the whole world, Denise, and you chose to burn it down." Harold tried to move forward, his palm extended. Marcus, son, put your anger aside. We can work through this. Don't call me son. Marcus roared, his voice rattling the walls. You lost that right the second you touched her. The words echoed like a gavel striking judgment. Harold froze, his mouth open, searching for a defense that wouldn't come. Marcus's hand went instinctively to his waistband, where the weight of his pistol pressed against his hip. He hadn't brought it for them. It was a trucker's protection, a habit from long nights parked in desolate lots. But now, it burned in his grip like it was meant for this very moment. Denise saw the movement, and her eyes widened with terror. Marcus, no. Please, don't do this. We can fix it, I promise. I'll leave. I'll do whatever you want, just don't. Her words were drowned in Marcus's ragged breathing. Images flashed in his mind. Every night he called her and heard the distance in her voice. Every Sunday dinner where she smiled more at Harold than him. Every whisper of gossip he had brushed off. The puzzle pieces had been there all along, and now they formed a picture so cruel he wished he could rip it apart. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? Marcus's voice broke, raw and jagged. I gave you my life, Denise. And you? He turned his gaze on Harold, his eyes blazing. And you were supposed to protect me, not destroy me. The bathroom stall seemed smaller by the second, the walls closing in as Marcus's rage pressed harder against his ribs. His finger hovered near the trigger, his hand trembling with the weight of a choice he never thought he'd have to make. Harold took a cautious step, lowering his voice. Put the gun down, son. Don't throw your life away over one mistake. One mistake. Marcus's laugh was hollow, broken. You call this a mistake? You've been stealing pieces of me every time you touched her. And now there's nothing left. The customers outside could hear the shouts, some already dialing 911. A child cried out. A mother whispered prayers under her breath. But inside that hallway, the world had narrowed to 3 people, bound together by betrayal and fury. Marcus's chest heaved as he raised the gun, his eyes flicking between the 2 faces he once trusted most. And in that frozen instant, one truth became clear. Whatever happened next, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The hallway of that KFC had gone deathly still, the sounds of fryers hissing and children laughing muffled beneath the storm raging in Marcus's chest. His hand trembled around the gun, sweat beating down his temples, his eyes locked on the 2 people who had shattered everything he thought was sacred. Denise's sobs filled the air. She clutched her blouse, her hands shaking, her voice desperate. Marcus, please, this doesn't have to end like this. Put the gun down. We can talk. Talk. Marcus's voice cracked, torn between grief and fury. Talk about how you climbed into bed with my father while I was out busting my back to keep a roof over your head. Talk about how every time I told myself I was crazy, you proved me right. Harold raised his hands higher, his deep voice carrying the tone of a preacher trying to calm a congregation. Son, listen to me. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But killing us won't heal you. It'll just damn you forever. Don't preach to me. Marcus snapped, his voice echoing off the tiles. You stood in church every Sunday telling folks how to live right, all while sneaking around with my wife. You damned yourself the moment you touched her. The tension in that hallway stretched so tight it felt like the walls might crack. Denise's tears streamed faster, her voice frantic now. I swear to God, Marcus, I'll leave him. I'll leave you too. Just let us live. Please. Marcus's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding so hard his head throbbed. Leave me? You already did. The minute you let him touch you, you left me. His eyes burned with tears, his finger trembling on the trigger. Y'all took everything from me. My marriage. My family. My pride. What the hell is left? The gun shook in his hand. For one fleeting second, Harold thought he might break through to his son. He stepped forward, slow and steady, his voice low. You still have a choice, Marcus. You can walk away. You can let this go before it swallows you whole. Marcus's breath came out ragged, a growl deep in his chest. Walk away? and live every day seeing your faces in my mind. Knowing my wife and my father betrayed me in the dirtiest way a man can be betrayed. I can't walk away from that. Not now. Not ever. And then the moment snapped. The gun roared, the explosion deafening in the narrow hall. Denise's scream cut off in an instant as her body crumpled against the stall wall, sliding down in a heap, her blouse stained red. Harold staggered forward, his face a mask of shock and devastation. "No," he cried, reaching for her. "Dear God, Marcus." Another shot tore through the air, striking Harold square in the chest. His body jerked backward before collapsing beside Denise, father and son's wife lying lifeless together on the cold, greasy tiles. Silence fell like a hammer. The only sound was Marcus's ragged breathing, the gun still smoking in his trembling hand. His vision blurred with tears as he looked at what he'd done. Two people lying in a pool of betrayal and blood, their eyes wide and empty. From the dining room came shrieks of terror, the sound of people scrambling, chairs clattering to the floor. A mother shielded her child. A man shouted into his phone, "There's been a shooting, hurry." The chaos outside the bathroom door contrasted with the eerie stillness inside, where Marcus stood frozen, trapped between shock and fury. He dropped to his knees, the gun slipping from his grasp, clattering onto the tile. He pressed his hands to his face, his body shaking. "You took everything from me," he whispered, his voice hollow, broken. "Everything." For a moment, Marcus felt as if the walls themselves were collapsing inward, pressing against his chest until he couldn't draw a full breath. His mind reeled, not just with what he had seen, but with what he had done. He had pulled the trigger, not once but twice. The sound still thundered in his ears, drowning out the distant screams beyond the bathroom door. He looked at his hands, trembling and stained, and a sick realization swept over him. The same hands that once held Denise with tenderness, the same hands that had shaken his father's in respect, had now ended them both. He whispered through clenched teeth, "What have I become?" But even as the question left his lips, the answer twisted back at him like a cruel mirror. He wasn't just a betrayed husband or a broken son anymore. He was a killer, made in the heat of betrayal, but a killer all the same. The thought hollowed him out, leaving nothing but an echo where his soul used to be. The hallway reeked of blood and gunpowder. The once ordinary KFC had turned into a nightmare crime scene. And Marcus Bell, the man who had only wanted a simple life, now stood as the destroyer of it all, his rage unleashed, his future forever sealed. The gun clattered to the floor, but the echo of those shots lingered in the air like thunder that refused to fade. Marcus stood there, hunched and trembling, his palms pressed to his face as if he could hide from the carnage at his feet. Denise and Harold lay twisted together, their blood pooling on the tile, their eyes frozen open in a stare that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Outside the bathroom, the world erupted into chaos. Customers screamed, dishes shattered against the floor, and the restaurant staff huddled in the kitchen, calling frantically for help. The shrill cries of children mingled with the terrified shouts of adults, all desperate to escape what had just turned an ordinary afternoon into a scene of horror. The sound of sirens cut through the panic, growing louder, closer, until red and blue lights flashed through the greasy windows. Tires screeched as squad cars swarmed the parking lot. The faint thud of boots on asphalt echoed as officers stormed toward the entrance, guns drawn, eyes sharp. Inside the hallway, Marcus didn't move. His body shook, but not from fear, something deeper, something emptier. The rage that had consumed him only minutes before had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man staring at the irreversible truth of his actions. The bathroom door swung open with a bang, and officers filled the space in seconds. Their weapons rose, their voices thundered. "Drop the weapon. Hands where we can see them." Marcus lifted his head slowly, his face streaked with sweat and tears. The pistol already lay abandoned on the floor, gleaming under the fluorescent light. He raised his hands, fingers spread wide, his voice barely a whisper. "They took everything from me," he muttered, his words cracking in the silence. "Everything." The officers moved incautiously, their eyes darting to the lifeless bodies, the blood smeared across the tiles. One of them, an older cop with weary eyes, stepped forward, cuffing Marcus's wrists behind his back with practiced precision. "You're under arrest for murder," the officer said flatly, his tone carrying no judgment, only procedure. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't beg. He didn't even flinch. He simply let them guide him out of the bathroom, his feet dragging, his eyes locked on the ground as though he couldn't bear to face the world. As they escorted him through the restaurant, the chaos dimmed to a stunned silence. Customers huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared at Marcus as though he were a ghost walking among them. A woman clutched her child tightly, her voice trembling. "Why, Lord? Why here?" Marcus lifted his head just enough for their eyes to meet. His voice was raw, barely audible, but it carried through the silence. "Ask them," he said. "Ask what they were doing." The words chilled the room more than the gunshots had. Out in the parking lot, cameras had already arrived, flashing lights capturing the image of Marcus Bell being led in handcuffs from the restaurant. His shirt was stained with blood, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion. Reporters shouted questions he couldn't hear, their voices drowned beneath the ringing in his ears. He was placed into the back of a squad car, the heavy door slamming shut beside him. As the engine roared to life, Marcus stared out the window, his reflection warped by the flashing lights. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what had happened. His wife gone, his father gone, his own freedom slipping through his fingers. In that moment, Marcus wasn't a husband, a son, or even a murderer. He was simply a man hollowed out by betrayal, left to face the wreckage of choices made in a storm of rage. And as the sirens wailed into the distance, the greasy smell of fried chicken lingered in the air, mocking, ordinary, a reminder that tragedy doesn't wait for the right place or time. It strikes where it wants, even in the most mundane corners of American life. News of the KFC bathroom murders spread through Friloda like wildfire. By evening, the entire town buzzed with whispers, phone calls, and rumors that twisted with every retelling. What had once been a quiet community known for its Sunday services and small-town charm was now the center of a scandal so grotesque people could barely speak of it without lowering their voices. At the corner diner, where townsfolk usually gathered for pie and coffee, the talk was relentless. Some leaned across booths with wide eyes, whispering as if saying the words too loud would summon the tragedy closer. Others sat in silence, stirring coffee they never drank, shaking their heads in disbelief. "Did you hear?" one woman muttered, her hands trembling around her mug. He caught them together, his wife and his own daddy, right there in the bathroom. A man across the counter snorted bitterly. "Can you blame him for snapping? I'm not saying it's right, but Lord, that's betrayal of the worst kind." Another shook his head. "Murder ain't the answer. No matter what they did, you don't take lives like that. Not in cold blood." The community fractured into two camps, those who saw Marcus as a cold-blooded killer, and those who saw him as a broken man pushed beyond human limits. The line wasn't clean. Even church members, who once looked up to Harold as a deacon, didn't know where to stand. How could a man who preached fidelity and loyalty stand accused of betraying his own son in such a vile way? On Main Street, the arguments spilled into the open. Outside the grocery store, two neighbors nearly came to blows. One insisting Marcus was a murderer who should never see daylight again. The other shouting that any man would have done the same if he'd walked in on such a betrayal. At the diner, a group of older men debated so loudly that the waitress refused to serve them coffee until they lowered their voices. "You think you know rage?" one barked, slamming his fist on the counter. You don't know rage until you've been gutted by your own blood. Across from him, another man shook his head, his voice firm. Rage don't excuse killing. If we let that stand, we're saying justice is just about who hurts the most. Even in the pews of First Baptist, the divide was visible. Some prayed for Marcus's soul, whispering that he was a victim first, a killer second. Others bowed their heads for Denise, painting her as the only true casualty. And in hushed corners, a few muttered about Harold, wondering if his reputation as a righteous man had been nothing more than smoke hiding fire. The fractures ran so deep that neighbors stopped greeting each other on porches. Old friendships iced over. The tragedy had not only destroyed the Bell family, it had set the entire town at war with itself. At First Baptist Church, the pastor tried to address the congregation that Sunday, but the weight in the air was too heavy. Some wept openly. Others stared at the empty pew where Harold once sat, his deep voice echoing in memory. Denise's absence was another ghost in the room, a reminder of how sin and secrecy had burned two families to ash. Marcus's mother, Lorraine, was perhaps the most broken of all. Reporters caught sight of her on her porch, her hair wrapped in a scarf, her face lined with grief. She clutched a Bible to her chest as neighbors tried to offer comfort. "My husband betrayed me," she whispered to a friend, her voice barely holding steady. "And my son, my baby boy, he'll die in prison for it." How does a woman survive that? Her pain became the town's symbol, a living reminder of what betrayal costs when it festers in silence. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his jail cell, the echoes of his actions still replaying in his mind. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him, but all he saw were the faces of Denise and Harold, pleading, crying, then silent. Every whisper in town reached him through newspapers and TV broadcasts. He read the headlines again and again. Husband slays wife and father in KFC bathroom horror. Community shaken by deacon's double life. The weight of shame pressed on him. He knew some people pitted him, saw him as the ultimate victim of betrayal. But others spit his name like venom, branding him not as a man wronged, but as a murderer who had turned a family tragedy into a public spectacle. One evening, as he sat on the narrow cot in his cell, his lawyer came to see him. She placed a stack of papers on the table between them and studied him carefully. "They're going to come hard at you, Marcus," she said gently. "The prosecutor wants to make an example out of this." But the community split. Some folks are saying they'd have done the same thing if they'd walked in on that scene. Marcus let out a hollow laugh. "Yeah, they say that now. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel their whole life snap in 1 second. His lawyer nodded, her eyes soft with sympathy. "The jury will have to decide whether they see a monster or a man who was broken past repair." Back in town, people prayed, argued, and speculated. The case wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about loyalty, betrayal, and the dark places the human heart can go when pushed too far. And as the trial date loomed closer, the community braced itself, knowing the story of Marcus Bell wasn't done tearing them apart. The courthouse in Friloda had never seen this much attention. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing as deputies escorted Marcus Bell inside, shackled at the wrists and ankles. The town had turned out in force, neighbors, church members, even strangers from nearby counties, hungry to witness the trial that had turned their quiet community into a national headline. Inside, the air was tense, thick with judgment and curiosity. The jury filed in, their faces tight and unreadable. On one side of the courtroom sat Denise's family, grief carved into their expressions. On the other sat Marcus's mother, Lorraine, clutching her Bible with trembling hands, her eyes red from nights spent crying. When the judge entered and the trial began, the prosecutor wasted no time painting Marcus as a man consumed by jealousy and rage. He paced before the jury, his voice sharp, his words cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen, this was not justice. This was not a man defending his home. This was execution. Marcus Bell did not stumble into a misunderstanding. He found his wife and his father, and he chose vengeance over reason. He fired not one, but 2 shots, killing them both in cold blood. And today, we ask you to hold him accountable. The jury shifted uneasily as the prosecutor laid out the state's case. Eyewitness testimony of Marcus storming into the hallway, terrified customers who had heard the shouts, and the ballistics report confirming his gun had fired the fatal rounds. Photos of the KFC bathroom, grim and bloody, flashed on a screen. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Marcus sat still, his eyes lowered, his hands folded in front of him. Every picture was a knife, but he didn't flinch. He had already lived it. The courtroom was just replaying his nightmare for the world to see. Then it was the defense's turn. Marcus's attorney, a seasoned woman with a calm but commanding presence, rose from her chair and faced the jury. Marcus Bell is not a cold-blooded killer, she began, her voice steady. He is a husband. He is a son. And on that day, he became a victim of a betrayal so vile that none of us can truly imagine the depth of his pain. Imagine walking into that bathroom. Imagine seeing your wife, the woman you vowed to spend your life with, and your father, the man who raised you, locked in an embrace that shattered your world in one breath. How would you react? Would you have walked away as though nothing happened? Or would your very soul have cracked under the weight of it? She walked slowly toward Marcus, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. He didn't go there looking for violence. He went there to buy his wife her favorite meal. He went there with love in his heart, not hate. But in seconds, love was replaced by a kind of pain most of us will never know. Marcus Bell snapped because he was human. The jury's eyes flicked back and forth between the cold facts of murder and the defense's portrait of a man broken by betrayal. Witnesses were called. A teenage cashier, voice trembling, recounted the gunshots, saying she'd never forget the look on Marcus's face, like his whole world had just ended. A neighbor testified about the gossip, the whispers of Harold and Denise being seen too close, too often. When Marcus finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was low, raspy, but it carried through every corner of the room. I didn't plan it, he said, his eyes glistening. I didn't walk in there wanting blood. I walked in there wanting to bring my wife dinner. But when I saw them together, my wife and my father, it felt like my chest ripped open. Like my life was a lie. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was pain. And I wished to God I'd walked away. But I didn't. The room was heavy with his confession. Even the prosecutor sat still for a moment, his pen frozen above his notepad. By the end of the day, the courtroom wasn't just deciding Marcus Bell's guilt. It was wrestling with a question older than law itself. When betrayal cuts deep enough to kill, is the man who breaks still a monster, or just a man who was pushed past the edge? For 3 long days, the jury listened. They heard the prosecutor's sharp words, the defense's pleas, and Marcus's own broken testimony. They saw the photos no one could unsee, and they felt the weight of a story that cut deeper than any tabloid headline. When both sides rested, the jurors filed out, their faces pale and unreadable, leaving the courtroom suspended in a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air. Marcus sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly, his wrists cuffed. He stared down at the wood grain, tracing it with his eyes like a map that might lead him back to the man he once was. Behind him, Lorraine sat clutching her Bible, whispering prayers under her breath. Across the aisle, Denise's family sat stiff and cold, their grief etched in stone. Hours passed, the courthouse filled with restless murmurs. Reporters crowded the hallways, cameras ready to beam the verdict across the country. In town, televisions in diners, barbershops, and gas stations flickered with live coverage. Everyone waited to hear if Marcus Bell would walk the rest of his life as a broken man behind bars, or if mercy had a place in his story. When the jury finally returned, the room rose to its feet. The foreman, A middle-aged man with weary eyes carried a folded slip of paper in his hand. The judge took it, read it silently, and passed it back. The foreman cleared his throat. The weight of 12 lives balanced on his voice. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Bell, guilty of second-degree murder. The words cracked through the courtroom like a whip. A sharp intake of breath swept across the gallery. Denise's mother wept openly, her sobs echoing off the walls. Lorraine let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a prayer, her trembling hands covering her face. Marcus didn't move. His shoulders sagged, his eyes stayed fixed on the table. He didn't look at the jury, didn't look at his mother, didn't even look at the judge. The verdict wasn't a surprise. It was simply the confirmation of a reality he had already accepted in that bathroom, kneeling on the blood-soaked floor. The judge's gavel struck, calling for order. Mr. Bell, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. You will be remanded immediately to the custody of the state. The words rang in Marcus's ears, final and heavy. Life in prison. Not death, but not freedom. A sentence that meant years of walls and chains, years of staring at ceilings and remembering the faces of the dead. His attorney leaned close, her voice soft. It could have been worse. They spared you the death penalty. Marcus turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. His voice was a whisper, hollow and resigned. Death would have been easier. As deputies led him from the courtroom, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted his name. Marcus, do you regret it? Marcus, why did you do it? He didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. Outside, the town remained split. Some said justice had been served, that no matter the betrayal, no man had the right to play executioner. Others whispered that Marcus was already punished long before the trial, when he opened that bathroom stall and saw his world crumble. But inside the steel confines of the transport van, Marcus sat in silence, shackled and broken. He stared through the narrow slit of glass as the courthouse disappeared behind him. The town, the whispers, the cameras, all of it faded into the distance. What remained was the hollow truth. His wife was gone, his father was gone, his mother was left to grieve them both, and he was no longer a free man. The jury had spoken, but the real verdict had been decided the moment he pulled that trigger. And in his heart, Marcus knew, no sentence could ever be harsher than the memory he carried with him, a memory that would haunt him long after the cell doors clanged shut. The town of Friloda would never forget the day its quiet streets were splashed across national headlines. KFC bathroom murders, the tabloids called it, as if giving it a lurid nickname could capture the tragedy in full. But for those who lived there, it wasn't just a story, it was a wound, one that cut through families, church pews, and kitchen tables. The restaurant reopened weeks later. The tiles had been scrubbed, the walls repainted, the smell of grease and fried chicken returned as if nothing had happened. But the people who walked through those doors still felt the chill. Some swore they couldn't eat there again, not with the memory of gunfire echoing in their heads. Others went back out of habit, lowering their voices whenever the hallway came into view. Lorraine, Marcus's mother, never returned. She buried her husband and her daughter-in-law within days of each other, then sat alone in a pew at Harold's funeral while whispers rippled through the crowd. Was Harold a hypocrite? A sinner hiding behind the cloth? Or just a man who made the worst mistake of his life? The questions had no answers, only pain. At home, Lorraine's house became a shrine of sorrow. Family pictures lined the walls, Harold in his deacon's suit, Marcus as a boy holding a fishing rod, Denise smiling in her wedding dress. But to her, they were ghosts. She prayed for her son, but when she looked at those photos, she saw only a family undone by secrets. Inside prison, Marcus moved through his days like a shadow. He didn't fight, didn't curse, didn't even raise his voice. Inmates whispered about him, some with pity, others with awe. That's the man who killed his wife and his father, they said, shaking their heads. Marcus never corrected them. He carried the weight quietly, like a man dragging chains no one else could see. One gray afternoon, Marcus heard his name called for visitation. He shuffled into the small room, chains clinking, and froze when he saw Lorraine waiting behind the glass. Her face was tired, her hands clasped around a worn Bible, her eyes red from sleepless nights. When the receiver clicked in his hand, silence filled the line for a long moment. Finally, Lorraine's voice broke through, shaky but firm. "Marcus, you're still my boy. Nothing can take that away." Marcus lowered his head, tears stinging his eyes. "Mama, I destroyed everything. Daddy's gone. Denise is gone. You shouldn't even be here looking at me." Lorraine shook her head, pressing her palm against the glass as if she could reach through it. "I lost a husband and a daughter-in-law. But I can't lose you too, Marcus. You're all I have left. Don't let this prison swallow what's left of your soul." He wanted to answer, but his throat tightened, words collapsing into a whisper. "I wish you could hate me, Mama. It would be easier if you did." Lorraine's lips trembled, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. "I'll never hate you. I'll pray for you till my last breath. Because if I stop, who else will?" The guard called time, and Lorraine was led away, her figure shrinking until she was gone. Marcus sat frozen, clutching the receiver, the echo of her words filling the hollow place inside him. At night, he lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, the faces of Denise and Harold flashing in his mind. Sometimes he heard their voices. Sometimes he heard the echo of the gunshots. But most often, he heard his own words, spoken in the aftermath. "They took everything from me." And yet, in the silence of his cell, he began to realize something even darker. That pulling the trigger hadn't given him back what was stolen. It had only left him emptier. He had destroyed them, but in doing so, he had destroyed himself too. The town wrestled with its own verdict. To some, Marcus was a monster who had turned betrayal into butchery. To others, he was a tragic figure, pushed past the edge by wounds no man should ever endure. Both sides argued late into the night at diners, barbershops, and church steps. No one ever fully agreed. Years later, when people spoke of the case, they didn't just speak of the murders. They spoke of trust and how fragile it is. They spoke of how lies can rot a family from the inside out, until the whole thing collapses in one violent moment. They spoke of betrayal, the kind that doesn't just hurt but destroys. The KFC bathroom murders became a cautionary tale. Parents whispered it to their children as a warning about honesty. Pastors twisted it into sermons about sin and temptation. And men and women across Friloda looked at their own marriages with new eyes, wondering what truths might be hiding behind the smiles across their dinner tables. For Marcus, the story ended behind bars. But for the people left behind, the story lived on. A reminder that the deepest wounds aren't always the ones we can see. They are the ones carried in silence, the ones that fester in the dark, until one day they explode. And in the quiet corners of town, when the gossip faded and the whispers stilled, the tragedy of Marcus Bell lingered. Not just as a murder case, but as a lesson. Betrayal doesn't just break hearts. Sometimes it ends lives. At the KFC where it all began, employees whispered that the bathroom never felt the same. Some swore that late at night, when the store was nearly empty, they heard the faint slam of a stall door or the muffled sound of a man's broken sob. Others refused to clean that hallway alone, claiming the air grew colder the closer they stepped toward the tiles that had once run red. For the town's younger generation, the story became an urban legend. Teenagers dared each other to spend a minute in the men's restroom with the lights off, listening for Marcus's voice. Most laughed it off, but a few came out pale, swearing they heard whispers. "They took everything from me." It was a haunting reminder that no matter how much paint you slap on the walls, no matter how many meals you serve, some places never shake off the shadows of what happened there. And for Friloda, that bathroom was more than a room. It was a scar, a permanent reminder that betrayal had carved its mark into the heart of the town and would never fully fade.